This is a presentation on civil rights reform during the 1960s. This presentation explores the relationship between grassroots civil rights activists and federal workers, the motivations of each group for their actions, and which group actually deserves more credit for civil rights reform during this time period. Civil rights legislation passed during this time period included the 24th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. While it obviously took action on the part of politicians to get this legislation passed, grassroots activists actually deserve more credit for civil rights legislation during this time, which is evidenced by the photo of President Johnson giving Martin Luther King Jr., a civil rights activist, the pen he used to sign the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Civil rights activists were motivated to call for reform for obvious reasons. African Americans, Mexican Americans, and several other minorities were desperate for change because of the discrimination they faced. Martin Luther King, in his letter from Birmingham jail, describes the segregation and violence faced by African Americans, and David Havens, in his reflections on the beginning of the Farm Workers Organization, describes an incident involving a Mexican American high school student who was thrown out of school and into jail. This incident upset the Mexican American community where Havens worked so much that they too were, quote, ready to act. Activists responded to the discrimination they faced in the form of protests, such as the sanitation workers' strike pictured on top. This strike took place in Memphis, and Martin Luther King participated in this strike right before he was assassinated, and the photo on the bottom shows the famous Civil Rights March on Washington. Federal employees were motivated by two factors for passing civil rights legislation. Johnson, in his phone conversation with Martin Luther King Jr., appeared to have been motivated by his own conscience and was determined to have civil rights legislation attempted by President Kennedy passed. And other federal employees, such as congressmen, felt pressure from either Johnson or civil rights activists. In Johnson's conversation with Charles Halleck, we hear Charles Halleck ask for a recess, which would have resulted in further delay of civil rights legislation, and President Johnson puts pressure on him and other congressmen to stay until the civil rights legislation is passed. And also Martin Luther King, in his letter from Birmingham jail, says the administration must be prodded before it acts. The administration King was talking about was the Alabama administration. And in the photo on this slide, we see a large crowd gathered at a famous building in Washington, D.C., pressing for civil rights legislation. The relationship between federal workers and civil rights activists can be characterized by tension and also by reliance. There was obvious tension between federal workers and civil rights activists because of civil rights activists putting pressure on federal workers who are reluctant to pass civil rights legislation, and President Johnson appears to have relied very heavily on Martin Luther King Jr. He tells Martin Luther King Jr. in his November 25, 1963 phone conversation with him how much he needs his help, and he also later on asks for Martin Luther King's input regarding the Watts riot in 1965. Civil rights reform did not happen without a cost, and civil rights activists paid most of that cost. Sometimes they paid with jail time and sometimes with their very own lives. The photo on top is from the Alabama Department of Public Safety and shows Martin Luther King Jr. and lists a few times that he was arrested, and the photo on the bottom shows the vigil held for him after his assassination. Also, in Johnson's conversations about the Mississippi burning during the summer of 1964, we hear about the arrest and the brutal murder of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, three civil rights activists who were down in Mississippi investigating the burning of a church and were arrested for a minor offense. Upon their release, they were abducted and were never heard from for a good month until Johnson received the phone call from an FBI agent that their bodies had been found. In conclusion, the sacrifices made by civil rights activists, the pressure put on federal employees by civil rights activists, and reliance on civil rights activists by Lyndon B. Johnson are all evidence that grassroots activists deserve more credit for civil rights reform during this time period than politicians. Furthermore, if politicians were as motivated to pass civil rights legislation as these activists were to have it passed, civil rights reform would have happened much longer ago than it did. On this slide is bibliography of the sources used in this presentation, which include documents from the primary sources and photos from the Civil Rights Digital Library. I'm Susan Skelton, and thank you for listening.